Welcome back. Thanks for joining us. We are here what very well should be our very last session on the Book of Job. After that, we only have a couple chapters left, and then we're going to take a look at one of the books of the Apocrypha, the wisdom of Jesus, the son of Sirach, and we'll dive into that. But we have our last two chapters of Elihu's words, chapters 36 and 37 of Job. And so I'm going to ask a volunteer to read 36 for us.
I'll read. I wasn't here last week. And Elihu continued and said, "Bear with me a little. I will show you. For I have yet something to say on God's behalf. I will fetch my knowledge from afar and ascribe righteousness to my Maker. For truly my words are not false. One who is perfect in knowledge is with you. Behold, God is mighty and does not despise any. He is mighty in strength of understanding. He does not keep the wicked alive, but gives the afflicted their right. He does not withdraw his eyes from the righteous, but with kings upon the throne he sets them forever, and they are exalted. And if they are bound in fetters and caught in the cords of affliction, then he declares to them their work and their transgressions, that they are behaving arrogantly. He opens their ears to instruction and commands that they return from iniquity. If they hearken and serve him, they complete their days in prosperity, and their years in pleasantness. But if they do not hearken, they perish by the sword, and die without knowledge. The godless in heart cherish anger. They do not cry for help when he binds them. They die in youth, and their life ends in shame. He delivers the afflicted by their affliction, and opens their ear by adversity. He also lured you out of distress, into a broad place where there was no cramping. And what was set on your table was full of fatness. But you are full of the judgment on the wicked. Judgment and justice seize you. Beware lest wrath entice you into scoffing, and let not the greatness of the ransom turn you aside. Will your cry avail to keep you from distress, or all the force of your strength? Do not long for the night, when peoples are cut off in their place. Take heed, do not turn to iniquity, for this you have chosen rather than affliction. Behold, God is exalted in his power. Who is a teacher like him? Who has prescribed for him his way? And who can say, Thou hast done wrong? Remember to extol his work, of which men have sung. All men have looked on it. Man beholds it from afar. Behold, God is great, and we know him not. The number of his years is unsearchable. For he draws up the drops of water, he distills his mist in rain, which the skies pour down and drop upon man abundantly. Can anyone understand the spreading of the clouds, the thunderings of his pavilion? Behold, he scatters his lightning about him and covers the roots of the sea. For by these he judges peoples, he gives food in abundance, he covers his hands with the lightning, and commands it to strike the mark. Its crashing declares concerning him, who is jealous with anger against iniquity.
Okay, thank you. So, very similar to what we've heard from Elihu already. He's coming from a perspective that is more religious than the rest of the book of Job, or at least more theological. He's going to talk more, he's going to more positively lift up God in these texts. He presents himself as having a different point of view, which we read earlier. He says it more bluntly, than any of the four, Job or his three friends. And yet, what is his position on wisdom, which is really the question the book is asking, is what is wisdom? And his position seems to be pretty much the same as the three friends. God's going to punish the bad people and reward or rescue the good people. It's really not any different than what the three friends kept trying to tell Job over and over and over again. But he throws in a bunch of questions, which whoever added Elihu to the book knows that Job's never going to get it to answer, nor is God going to rebuke, because his words are being added to the book after the fact. So he's safe to say anything he wants to say. When you insert yourself into a conversation that's already happened, like yelling at your TV, nobody's going to respond or contradict you. That's kind of what Elihu is. The Elihu is the yelling at the TV after the fact. In this passage, though, that's largely he's lifting up God and he's trying to drive home the same narrative. And of course, we know that the wisdom he suggests doesn't always hold up. He especially this section 5 through 12, where he talks about kings, that God lifts up kings and puts them in their place for life or for eternity or whatever, which of course time has shown that the kings have all pretty much fallen. The last ones to go, the royal family in Britain, are facing the precipice. I don't know if you saw the news, I forget if it's today or yesterday. Polls in Great Britain, surveys in Great Britain, have the royal family at their lowest approval rating ever. There's something like 40% of young adults in Great Britain want to abolish the monarchy now, which is I guess it's never been that high before. I don't know.
There was, I lived in England for 6 months and got to know several people. Actually, Barb did more than I did, but there was a fair amount of skepticism then. That was 1979. So
yeah, but it goes on to say that if kings do iniquity, going back to Job, that God will open their ears and essentially give them a chance to correct their iniquity, and if they don't, God will directly punish them and they'll die by the sword. And if they correct it, well, then they'll have long days, which we all know that there have been good kings who were overthrown, and especially by outside militaries. And there are utterly ruthless and brutal kings who lived into old age. So,
well, and that's true in society too.
Right. So that doesn't really evidence the kind of wisdom that Elihu is lifting up, is what I'm saying.
We'll go back to Ecclesiasticus now.
I mean, Job is, like I've been saying, Job is very much more in line with Ecclesiastes than with traditional literature. Although I think Job makes the effort to present both cases, which is why when we get to the chapters that we've already read, where God speaks, God doesn't actually come down and say, here's what wisdom is, or here's who's right and wrong. God comes down and says, you're mortal and you don't know what I know. And who has wisdom? Where is wisdom? God has it. That's it. End of story. No answers. So, leaves us in that dilemma. Any other thoughts, questions on this chapter? Anything jump out? Chapter 37, if someone would.
I'll read that. At this my heart pounds and leaps from its place. Listen, listen to the roar of his voice, to the rumbling that comes from his mouth. He unleashes his lightning beneath the whole heaven and sends it to the end of the earth. After that comes the sound of his roar. He thunders with his majestic voice. When his voice resounds, he holds nothing back. God's voice thunders in marvelous ways. He does great things beyond our understanding. He says to the snow, fall on the earth, and to the rain shower, be a mighty downpour, so that everyone he has made may know his work. He stops all people from their labor. The animals take cover, they remain in their dens. The tempest comes out from its chamber, the cold from the driving winds. The breath of God produces ice, and the broad waters become frozen. He loads the clouds with moisture. He scatters his lightning through them. At his direction they swirl around over the face of the whole earth to do whatever he commands them. He brings the clouds to punish people, or to water his earth and show his love. Listen to this, Job. Stop and consider God's wonders. Do you know how God controls the clouds and makes his lightning flash? Do you know how the clouds hang poised, those wonders of him who has perfect knowledge? You who swelters in your clothes when the land lies hushed under the south winds. Can you join him in spreading out the skies, hard as a mirror of cast bronze? Tell us what we should say to him. We cannot draw up our case because of our darkness. Should he be told that I want to speak? Would anyone ask to be swallowed up? Now no one can look at the sun, bright as it is in the skies, after the wind has swept them clean. Out of the north he comes in golden splendor. God comes in awesome majesty. The Almighty is beyond our reach and exalted in powers. In his justice and great righteousness he does not oppress. Therefore people revere him. For does he not have regard for all the wise in heart?
Thank you. So we get a little bit of lifting up God in the first 13 verses. And then he turns to Job. Hear this, O Job, right? And what does he do? He writes the way God is written in the book of Job. I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions to which you don't know the answers. And I'm going to challenge that you don't really know things. Which, if we're reading Job not knowing that Elihu is likely a later addition, certainly makes Elihu look like the smartest and wisest of all of them, right? Because, oh, gee, look, in a couple of chapters, God's going to speak the same way. Or actually, no, right now. God's going to speak next. The same way that Elihu just got done speaking. So Elihu must be wise. So when God doesn't answer our questions, because in this book, God's not going to answer it, where do you turn? Oh, the wisest one who sounded just like God, Elihu. Even though his argument for what wisdom is the same as the three men. It's a clever way to change the meaning of the book, isn't it?
It's a clever way to change what?
The meaning of the book of Job as a whole.
Oh. So who do you think, or why did this author step in?
So if we take Job in its original form, you've got someone who essentially is writing a story to pose the question, what is wisdom and where does wisdom come from? And the book, because in the world, the world that this author is living in, is one has a tradition of suggesting that what happens to a person is proof of wisdom, proof of whether they were good or bad. Right. So this is one of the great questions that has sort of plagued Christianity and a lot of other religions, is whether or not we can point to what happens as evidence of what kind of a person is, or whether God approves of a person or their decisions. Of course, anytime something bad happens to yourself, you're going to call it a coincidence. But when it happens to somebody who thinks or believes differently than you, then that's proof that God is against you. That's always the dilemma. So, let's use for instance. So our denomination, the ELCA, in 2009 made a decision that our individual churches could choose whether or not to accept and welcome LGBTQ people into their church. The ELCA church across the street from the venue where that happened, while they were meeting, was hit with a gust of wind or a bolt of lightning or something, and there was a cross in the building that fell over. Immediately, one of the other Lutheran denominations pointed at it and said, proof that God opposes what you're doing, and proof that you're wrong, and right there, and that was the argument. That was the evidence that our denomination was wrong to open up that possibility to congregations.
When was that?
2009, I believe.
Yeah.
So now turn to the modern day. We have very anti-LGBTQ things happening in several southern states. which are also at the same time being plagued with many very horrible natural disasters. Our denomination could, turn around and point to these horrible natural disasters and say, see, that's proof that God opposes what you're doing towards LGBTQ people. Except that's not really right. Just as pointing to the lightning bolt that knocked the cross off the church or whatever wasn't proof. It's circumstance. Both groups are going to look at their own situation and say, that was coincidence. Whether or not we start pointing to what happens to other people who disagree with us and say, well, the bad in your life proves you're wrong, it becomes problematic, because if you take it as a true sign, as a true principle, then every negative thing that happens in life is proof that we're wrong, that God opposes us. And that would be, I don't know if you've ever counted up how many bad things happen to you in life, but that turns into a very desperate and horrible and PTSD, anxiety-driven way of looking at life. Unless you just choose to ignore all the bad things that happen to you and only use it to point at your enemies. In which case, that's kind of a horrible way to look at it, at least in my opinion. But through the Hebrew Bible, that is one of the contexts that we get a lot of the time, is that the bad things that have happened to Israel, nations invading, droughts, floods, famine, are the product of God turning against the people for something they have done, usually for iniquity, for the way they treat the poor and the least and the worst off in their society. But also for turning to false gods, for worshiping Baal, whatever.
For doing bad things.
Right. So the prevailing wisdom, at least the prevailing wisdom of tradition, at the time that Job is written, is this way of looking to what happens to the world to determine whether something is right or wrong. But Job is also written late enough and with enough encounters with other cultures, with other philosophies and other ways of looking at life, that there would seem to be other notions of wisdom arising in the time period. And so Job is wrestling with that, and in its original format doesn't come to an answer other than we are mortals, not God, and we cannot know all there is to know. So, what is wisdom? We don't know. This is essentially what Job is saying, which is why I say it bears a lot of similarities to Ecclesiasticus, who says, you know what, you might as well just go about living your life and hope for the best, because you can't sit down and figure out all the right answers. Right? This is why I love Job and Ecclesiastes, because I don't think, my personal belief and opinion is that life is not about getting it right. I don't think we can live that way. How many hundreds of millions of people, how many hundreds of billions of people have lived on this planet, and we know that all of them got it wrong, because our science and medicine and technology have all proven that what we've believed through most of human history isn't right. So, is it about getting the right answers? Or is it about doing the best with what God gives us?
But we live in a society, and I think this is pretty much worldwide, where goodness is still praised or sought, and badness is punished.
Mm-hmm.
So, doesn't that reflect the concept that we still believe if you're good, you'll be rewarded, and if you're bad, you'll be punished?
Mm-hmm. Part of the dilemma, I think, I've been wrestling with this in discussions with others, especially around topics of the good and the evil in the world, is part of the dilemma is, I'm starting to think, part of the dilemma is that we believe in evil. That we believe evil exists. And it's interesting because the word that gets translated as evil in the Hebrew Bible, ra, doesn't mean evil. It means uncomfortable, painful, unpleasant, harmful, dangerous, generally bad, and we interpret that as wicked and evil. Sometimes it can mean morally wrong or ethically wrong, but this concept of absolute evil, like something horrible and terrible.
But all the words you just quoted or said were feelings and stuff, not, whereas the concept of evil is a thing.
Right. And there is no word in the Hebrew Bible, there's no word in Hebrew that we know of, or that at least that I know of, I've never heard of one, that represents the construct of evil. And so, Christianity being a religion that is rooted in the Hebrew Bible, Judaism, and, well, really, Hebraicism, Israelite religion, whatever you want to call it. It's interesting that we shift from a language that apparently has no word for concrete evil into a religion that has, through most of its history, suggested that there is an absolute good and an absolute evil that is in conflict in our world. And here's one of the interesting things, and this is getting purely philosophical. If there's concrete evil in the world, then there's something we can fight against and oppose and label as wrong and bad, right? If there is no such thing as concrete evil in the world, in creation, if God, who created everything and all there is, did not create concrete evil, and if we believe God to be good, it would make sense that God would not create concrete evil. Then anytime we look at the actions of another human being and think, that's evil, we're wrong. We've made a mistake. And instead, we have to ask, why did they do what they did? What is wrong in their lives? What is broken in their world that has caused this to come about? So if we believe that concrete evil exists in the world, then we have no obligation or responsibility to do anything to help the suffering of people who cause suffering. But if there's no such thing as evil in the world, then anytime we see what we would normally label as evil, we instead are looking at brokenness that we can at least attempt to help heal.
So
and cure.
should we strive to prevent and or stop actions that are causing suffering of others?
Well, that's the dilemma, is when we can label it evil, then
I didn't label it
I
evil.
know.
I labeled it causing suffering of others.
Right. So there's two ways to look at it. And one is, if you can label it evil, then you can wipe it off the planet because it's evil, and therefore you don't have to treat that problem. You just have to get rid of it. And so that thing that's causing suffering, you just wipe it out because it's evil. If there's no such thing as evil, then whatever's causing suffering is part of the world and needs to be cared for as well. Which means that our responsibility to people like Hitler is not necessarily to wipe them off the face of the planet, but to try to heal them. Now, that said,
in the meantime,
right, that said, if a person who is broken and causing harm also has great wealth and power, as Hitler did at the time of his rise, then maybe there's an argument to be said that there's no way we can even reach close enough to heal that person, and therefore we have to talk about alternatives.
but all the
cost
people
of
that
healing.
cause suffering of others on a grand scheme or a grand scale have power.
Not always, but I mean,
name somebody who has caused great suffering to humankind that
okay,
didn't have power.
Yeah. Oh, if you're talking about great suffering to humankind as a whole, yes. Right. Which illustrates that there is, at its core, a problem with power, with any individual possessing a great deal of power. Because how many of us are not broken in some way? So the only person who can who can handle the responsibility of great powers is someone who has nothing in them that is broken.
Does that justify the concept of representative government? Because in representative government, the power of an individual, supposedly, if it works perfectly, is limited by the masses,
Mm-hmm.
by the people who are being served.
Of course, the reality is that that's always been true.
It's not true of autocratic governments.
You don't think that if 1 billion people in China rose up and tried to take out the Chinese president, they could do it? Absolutely they could. If 1 billion people opposed their government representative, does not matter how much power they had. They would be forced to make one of two choices.
But there isn't
annihilate their whole country and wipe it off the planet, and then they have no power anymore.
That's true, but there's not a system in China for that to happen.
Well, there's always the option of rebellion.
At least in democratic societies,
Right.
India, United States, European countries, there's a system to change.
Right.
There's not a system to change in China.
Right. So what democracy does not give people power they don't already possess. It gives them an alternative.
It gives them a method.
It gives them an additional method. Because we can always overthrow leaders. Because leaders are always in the minority.
That's true.
Which is why the United States is not part of Great Britain. Because we rebelled. Right? And it's why India is not part of Great Britain right now, because it rebelled. It's part of why Tibet is only kind of part of China today. So the truth is that all people who have power, it is either given to them or yielded to them in some way. And that's true. That's been true throughout history. It's just that democracy makes it easier for the people to wield power. They don't have to risk their lives, in theory, to change things.
Okay.
So, but it does illustrate the problems of power. And I think that's one of the big issues I think that the Bible as a whole, and especially the New Testament, wrestles with. I think the whole Bible wrestles with the problem of the power of wealth. The problems of power in the Hebrew Bible are often kind of brushed off. In part because it's largely written at a time where great military war machines don't yet quite exist, right? Most of the Hebrew Bible is written at a time before the development of the phalanx, or the chariot, which are two of the earliest war machines created. Because if you get a large number of chariots.
But yeah, before that there were great Persian armies and.
No, Persian armies. The Great Persian Army comes hundreds of years after most of the Hebrew Bible is written, about 200 years.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so the one exception might be the Athenian war fleets might have. I'd have to check the dates on that. The great naval fleets of Athens may have existed prior to most of the writing down of these stories, although most of these stories were being told long before they were written down. So how do you date it? You date it to the 500s, the 6th century BCE when they're written down, or you date it back to the 1800th century, or the 180th century. No, yeah, 18th century BCE, when those stories are first getting told, or when some of these events happen. That's complex. But for the sake of Job, to bring us back, we have an original text that seems to want to wrestle with what wisdom is without giving us a definitive answer. We have the next stage, someone comes along and is uncomfortable with that ending, with the ending that God steps in and says, you're just mortal and you don't know anything. That's not a really great ending to a story. And so they add in, well, Job gets rich again. Don't we feel better? Nobody cares if their sons and daughters die as long as they get new sons and daughters, right? Well, today, that might be a little different. But so somebody fixes the ending. We get something similar in the Gospel according to Mark, because at the end of the Gospel according to Mark, Jesus appears to, I think it's Mary, and says, go tell them to meet me in Galilee, where this all started. And they all run away afraid and never tell anybody anything because they're afraid. And that's the original ending of the Gospel according to Mark. And then somebody tacks on 2 additional endings about how people saw Jesus again after that. Because it's an ending that leaves us uncomfortable. Well, even with Job getting rescued in the additional ending, his life getting fixed, we still don't have the question of what wisdom is. So then comes along a scribe or scholar or whatever and inserts Elihu in order to give us an answer to the unanswered question that Job presents, right? Here's Elihu, who sounds a lot like God, isn't God. He acknowledges he's not God. But he sounds, in the way he talks, a lot like God, and so God doesn't rebuke him, so he must have the answer. And so from Elihu we get our only answer. Which means that if you ever write a book, be careful about leaving unanswered questions, because somebody may come along later and want to answer them for you. Okay, that's it. We're moving on, because we've still got almost half an hour. We're going to take a look at the wisdom of Jesus, the son of Sirach, also known in the Hebrew Bible as the instruction of Yeshua ben Sirach, or in the Latin Vulgate, Ecclesiasticus, which means churchly. So I've given you kind of a longer detail sheet here. The things that I want to lift up are, in Protestant denominations, we include Sirach in our Apocrypha portion of the Bible, which means it's not really considered canonical in the Protestant church. It's generally accepted as either canonical or at least deuterocanonical, which means sort of a secondary authority, in the Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, and Asian Church of the East. And so it appears, I believe it appears in all of their Bibles pretty consistently. The interesting thing is the reason why Protestants put it into the Apocrypha had to do with the fact that the Jewish Bible version, the Hebrew Bible version of Sirach, and the Greek Christian version are significantly different in what's included. There's passages that are in one and not in the other. And that gave rise to the idea that it might not be an authority or authentic. However, after many years of many centuries of study, we actually have a pretty good idea that the person purporting to write this book is actually the person who wrote it. And there's no reason to doubt its authenticity. Time-wise, it's set somewhere between 200 and 180 BCE. It seems to be addressing an issue of tension between Hellenistic cultural values and traditional Jewish values. And the main time in Jewish history when this, or in Israelite history when this happens, is right around this intertestamental period, when we don't have a lot of writings that make it into the Bibles, when the remnants of Alexander the Great's kingdoms are fighting over the Levant, the area of the world that Israel is in, particularly the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, Ptolemies are down in Egypt, and the Seleucids are up in the Persian, Syrian area. And the Levant, the area, is caught in between. And so it changes hands a few times between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And the Ptolemies are not great people. I mean, what ancient empire was all that great? But so those who live under their rule, who are not really a full part of their kingdom and their belief system, write complaints. An example of this we get is another book that's in our Apocrypha called The Wisdom of Solomon, probably written in Alexandria, Egypt, has a lot of complaints about Egyptian religion and culture in it. Here, we have somebody writing in Jerusalem during the time when the Seleucids control it, and they don't seem to have too much of an issue with, Sirach doesn't seem to have too much of an issue with Egypt, but is really not happy with the Seleucids, which is not a surprise, because what's going to happen after this book is finished being written, or at least what we think is after this, time-wise, is after this book is written, is a Seleucid who rises to power named Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, will sack the temple in Jerusalem, strip out all the gold and silver, defile the religious accoutrements and whatnot, and essentially trigger a rebellion, which leads to more books that we have in our Apocrypha, which are the Maccabees, which tell of a time when Israel rebelled against the powers that ruled over the hegemony. And so the context of this is before this rebellion, civil war sort of situation against the Seleucids breaks out. And so the author is really dealing heavily with what does it mean to be Jewish? What does it mean, or Israelite? And what does it mean to have our culture and be exposed to this other culture when some are accepting that culture and some are rejecting it? And there is, for several centuries in the history of Israel, there's this big conflict that goes on internally between people who are accepting Greco-Roman values and people who want to hold on to a tradition that has been held for hundreds of years. Sound familiar? We're having that fight right now in the United States. There are other places in the world where they're having that. I mean, one could argue that conflict was going on in Ukraine. Those who wanted to hold on to ancient Russian values versus a large portion of Ukraine who wanted to kind of shift towards European cultural values. This is a common, classic situation for humanity to be in this struggle between, do we accept values of others? Do we look to what's new? Or do we cling to our history, our tradition, and our past? And so it's with that context that we receive this book. For those who, if you want to know, if you have the sheet, on the back of your sheet, and those online, this is on textweek.com, you can find this. There's a listing of, in the different traditions, when we actually have an option to read from this book in our church year. The Roman Catholic Church, the Episcopal Church, the Lutheran Church, and the United Methodists all have their typical calendars for the church year broken down in A, B, and C. A is 1 year, B is the next, C is the third, and then they go back to A. There are some alternatives that some churches use that have 4 years and so on and so forth, but this is sort of relatively recent tradition. And so you can see, like, the second week of Christmas, most of us have a reading from the 24th chapter of Sirach. So what I'd like to do is read...
Have you ever preached off Sirach?
No. What I'd like to do is I'd like to look at the first 6 chapters, which give us an introduction to this, because it's a really long book. I think it's 51 chapters. And
So that's what you got printed out here.
I have the first 6 chapters printed for those who don't have a Bible that has it. And we're going to look at those, and then what I'd like to do is, there's one chapter, because we've got a doctor in the room, there's a section on physicians, and I think we should read that just because you're here. And then I think we should go back and we should look at any of the ones that we did not already cover that are in the church here. We should at least take a look at and say, hey, that's be something I'd like to hear a sermon on or talk about. But that'll probably be next week. So, and that'll give us a broad exposure to a rather long book that I don't know that we need to read the whole thing. And if it catches your interest, you can always find a copy and read the whole thing if you like. So there's a prologue in this book, and we're pretty sure this prologue is actually written by the grandson of the author. So here's the prologue. Many great teachings have been given to us through the law and the prophets and the others. Probably means other books. The Hebrew Bible is divided into 3 sections in Judaism. The law, the prophets, and the writings. So he's probably making the same division here. And the others that followed them. And for these we should praise Israel for instruction and wisdom. Now those who read the scriptures must not only themselves understand them, but must also, as lovers of learning, be able, through the spoken and written word, to help the outsiders. So my grandfather, Yeshua, who had devoted himself especially to the reading of the law and the prophets and the other books of our ancestors, and had acquired considerable proficiency in them, was himself also led to write something pertaining to instruction and wisdom, so that by becoming familiar also with his book, those who love learning might make even greater progress in living according to the law. You are invited, therefore, to read it with goodwill and attention, and to be indulgent in cases where, despite our diligent labor in translating, we may seem to have rendered some phrases imperfectly. For what was originally expressed in Hebrew does not have exactly the same sense when translated into another language. Not only this book, but even the law itself, the prophecies, and the rest of the books differ not a little when read in the original. When I came to Egypt in the 38th year of the reign of Euergetes, and stayed for some time, I found opportunity for no little instruction. It seemed highly necessary that I should myself devote some diligence and labor to the translation of this book. During that time, I have applied my skill day and night to complete and publish the book for those living abroad who wish to gain learning and are disposed to live according to the law. Gee, I really wish this were actually in the Bible, because that introduction is great, in my opinion. Because nowhere else in the Bible does it highlight those issues. And wouldn't it be great if those were official canonical words in the Bible? So you get the sense that what this is the Greek copy of what his grandfather wrote down in Hebrew, and he's translating it for others. So there's a whole and I have this in the sheet that I handed out that kind of talks about how we have the 2 different versions. In the last 100-200 years, we've uncovered additional old copies that have expanded our knowledge. So, depending on what copy you're looking at of this, you might get a different amount of reading. Mine, for example, has sections that are marked off that say additional verses in the Hebrew, which means they weren't in the Greek, but in the Hebrew there's some extra verses. So, but with that said, How are we doing for time? Oh, we can get a chapter 1 at least. Would someone read chapter 1 for us?
I will. All wisdom is from the Lord God, and hath always been with him, and is before all time. Who hath numbered the sand of the sea, and the drops of rain in the days of the world? Who hath measured the height of heaven, and the breadth of the earth, and the depth of the abyss? Who hath searched out the wisdom of God that goeth before all things? Wisdom hath been created before all things, and the understanding of prudence from everlasting. The word of God on high is the fountain of wisdom, and her ways are everlasting commandments. To whom hath the root of wisdom been revealed, and who hath known her wise counsels? To whom hath the discipline of wisdom been revealed, and made manifest? And who hath understood the multiplicity of her steps? There is one most high, Creator Almighty, and a powerful King, and greatly to be feared, who sitteth upon his throne, and is the God of dominion. He created her in the Holy Ghost, and saw her, and numbered her, and measured her. And he poured her out upon all his works, and upon all flesh, according to his gift, and hath given her to them that love him. The fear of the Lord is honor, and glory, and gladness, and a crown of joy. The fear of the Lord shall delight the heart, and shall give joy, and gladness, and length of days. With him that feareth the Lord it shall go well in the latter end, and in the day of his death he shall be blessed. The love of God is honorable wisdom, and they to whom she shall show herself love her by the sight, and by the knowledge of her great works. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and was created with the faithful in the womb. It walketh with chosen women, and is known with the just and faithful. The fear of the Lord is the religiousness of knowledge. Religiousness shall keep and justify the heart. It shall give joy and gladness. It shall go well with him that feareth the Lord, and in the days of his end he shall be blessed. To fear God is the fullness of wisdom, and fullness is from the fruits thereof. She shall fill all her house with her incense, and the storehouses with her treasures. The fear of the Lord is a crown of wisdom, filling up peace, and the fruit of salvation. And it hath seen and numbered her, but both are the gifts of God. Wisdom shall distribute knowledge, and understanding of prudence, and exalteth the glory of them that hold her. The root of wisdom is to fear the Lord, and the branches thereof are long-lived. In the treasures of wisdom is understanding, and religiousness of knowledge. But to sinners wisdom is an abomination. The fear of the Lord driveth out sin, for he that is without fear cannot be justified, for the wrath of his high spirits is his ruin. A patient man shall bear for a time, and afterwards joy shall be restored to him. A good understanding will hide his words for a time, and the lips of many shall declare his wisdom. In the treasures of wisdom is the signification of discipline, but the worship of God is an abomination to a sinner. Son, if thou desire wisdom, keep justice, and God will give her to thee. For the fear of the Lord is wisdom and discipline, and that which is agreeable to him is faith and meekness, and he will fill up his treasures. Be not incredulous to the fear of the Lord, and come not to him with a double heart. Be not a hypocrite in the sight of men, and let not thy lips be a stumbling block to thee. Watch over them, lest thou fall, and bring dishonor upon thy soul. And God discover thy secrets, and cast thee down in the midst of the congregation. Because thou camest to the Lord wickedly, and thy heart is full of guile and deceit.
Thank you.
What is the Jewish word for fear?
That's a good question, and the Hebrew word is, I believe there's 2 or 3 of them. And if my recollection is right, there's one of them is very similar to the word we talked about earlier, which was ra, the word for evil. It's one of those. You said fear. Let me see if I can look this up.
Is there more than one Hebrew word that translates to fear?
I think there is. I'm trying to remember that. I often think the opposite way. I have to look at the Hebrew word and translate it. Yeah. So, Yara. See, I knew it was similar to Ra. Yara is probably the most common word for fear, to be afraid.
To be afraid.
To be afraid of, to reverence, to honor.
Honor.
Well, it's reverence, honor, fearful, dreadful, to inspire awe or reverence. It's my impression of.
Because for me, the interpretation or the translation "to be afraid" is contradictory
Of.
my concept of God.
Okay, to be afraid of God.
I'm not afraid of God.
Really?
No.
Someone can just, and you're done?
What?
No reason to be afraid of someone who can just, and you're done?
No. No.
It's an awful lot of power for.
Okay,
Gotcha.
but if you believe in the concept of a supreme being with love, then what's to be afraid of?
It's a very privileged point of view.
Okay.
Well, because so the fearing, I think fearing God is rooted in the perception that most of us wrestle with ethics and morality at various points in our lives. We all have moments of struggle where we're trying to decide about doing the right thing or the wrong thing.
What do you mean most? Everybody does.
Okay, good. Well, that's why I joke that it's a privileged point of view to not be afraid of someone who can snuff you out for doing the wrong thing. And
Well, but see, the concept of grace takes away the fear.
right, and so for pretty much the entire time of the Hebrew Bible, there's not a whole lot of concept of grace especially for individuals, right? It's our modern Christianity, and really the kind of Christianity that takes over probably around the time that Constantine accepts Christianity as the state religion. Our view of Christianity being our individual relationship with God is completely inconsistent with what's written in the Bible and the cultures and context of the people who are living at the time that the Bible is written. Because their cultural experience, their concept of the world is a lot more communal than ours is. And so,
What do you mean by that?
well, we tend to think about for most European and American and Canadian people, the Western world as a whole, our culture, our way of living our lives is very much about me as an individual, and maybe by extension, I'm a little worried about my family. And anything that I do in my community is not part of me. It's something that goes out from me to others, right? So when I do something like give to the local food pantry, I'm doing something out of myself that comes out of me and goes to others.
So I do it because it makes me feel good?
Right. Well, that's part of it. I mean, there's that philosophical debate about
So the gratification
this.
of being good is what makes one good?
Well, No, this, we're just talking about our concept of the individual versus the community. In a lot of these cultures, and of course, nobody who's around now was living then, so we don't know exactly how this played out. But the way the texts are written suggests that the way most people lived their lives or had their perception of the self was much more communal. So if someone did something that provided to the charity of their community, it was not perceived as I'm doing a good thing for others. It was I am part of this and I'm contributing to this. The way that if I do something that's beneficial for my wife or my daughter, I would think about it compared to if I do something for the food pantry. For them, in their culture, it's at least as best as we can understand it, it would seem they were more inclined to think about giving to their community, doing things for their community, doing things that benefited the poor and the underprivileged who lived in the area where they lived. Similarly to the way that we feel in, giving to our own kids. If that helps make the distinction. And so the fear of the Lord goes, as it's written in the Bible, goes well beyond this individual notion of, I did something wrong, thank God, God forgives me, therefore I'm not going to be worried about getting struck down on the spot that I stand in. Because for them, it was more along the lines of, uh-oh, I screwed up. Maybe some foreign nation's going to raid Israel and kill off 1 million people and drive us from our land, and we will spend the next 600 years living in the diaspora if we ever reconstitute our tribes ever again. So imagine the weight of that weighing on you when you're wrestling with, should I give $10 to this charity or not? Kind of changes the concept of our relationship with God, doesn't it?
I still go back to this concept of fear of God. Basically, as this was being read, as Lester was reading this, I was thinking that fear, however it's interpreted, is understanding that I am nothing, and that the supreme being, God, is everything.
That's probably a better translation of the word yara in Hebrew. I don't have the Greek, or actually this program that I'm using might have Sirach in it. Let me see if it does. I don't think it does. Just too bad. All right. So I don't know. There's two different Greek words for fear. The one that we're most familiar with is phobos, which is where we get phobia from, which is the true sense of being terrified, afraid, fearful of something. This Hebrew word yara is more. It can be to be frightened or terrified, but it can also be respect, awe. It's an acknowledgement of the vastness of difference between our power and God's power. And so that can manifest in positive and negative feelings.
Accepting that I am a speck.
Mm-hmm. And then the application of that.
I've never really, for 70 years, I've gone to church and heard fear of the Lord, the fear of God. I've never really given it any deep thought until recently. So that's kind of interesting.
If you give it, if you put it in the context of Scripture too, there's also, you're talking to, you're looking at, first off, we live in a world where we know what's happening in most of the world if we want to, right? We've got the 24-hour media cycle. We can access newspapers and the internet and everything else. So we know all these things that happen in the world. We got all kinds of scientific data which in a lot of ways can mollify us. We can look at a whole lot of data and see that surprising circumstances are obscure, right? So what we've talked about putting basketball hoops down there. I'll use this as an example. And one of the suggestions I made was maybe we should get chain nets so we can secure them in there permanently. They can't get stolen. Plus, it just sounds cool when you make a shot with a chain net. Well, I don't remember who. We don't need to talk about who, but somebody raised a concern that there could be lawsuits or issues with it. So I was talking to Anna in our office the other day, and she looked it up and she found a horror story on the internet where somebody was asking, can I sue the school? They had chain nets up and my kid cut their hand and had to get 10 stitches and all this other stuff. Well, first off, the lawyer said, no, you can't sue the school over that. So, and for a whole complex set of reasons. But
the main reason is that they're commercially available, therefore you don't sue the school, you sue the company that made them.
They're commercially available, and there's nothing to indicate that there's a significant amount of danger in their use. And interestingly enough, specifically the mother in this case identified that one of the things that had happened was the net had become partially undone, and it was not properly attached anymore. So the only way, so the lawyer said,
well, then you sue the church because they didn't maintain it.
You can sue the school, but only if you can prove that the school knew that there was something wrong with the hoop and that they failed after the fact to then address it. So you can't even sue the school for failing to maintain it. You have to prove that they knew there was a problem first and neglected to do anything about the problem. But if you actually look statistically, which was the next thing we did, the number of issues with nylon nets are pretty much on par with the number of issues with chain nets. It's a net. The problem is that you can get caught in it. It's a net. That's what nets do. They catch things. And so any time that somebody gets a finger caught up in it or something, they can tear their finger or whatever. And so the statistical probability of a chain net being worse than a nylon net is close to zero. But you can always look at it one of two ways. You can look at the horror story of it, or you can look at the statistical data. Well, we can now because we've got the internet and media and all of that. But if you lived in a world where the Bible and your personal experience is all you have, well, you've got the Great Flood, you've got Elijah calling down the fire from heaven and killing off 400 prophets, you've got Elisha calling out the she-bears to maul the little children for calling him Baldy. I mean, God's pretty violent in the perspective of people living in these cultures. So fear is not an inappropriate reaction. We're mollified by our statistics and the breadth of our knowledge, or at least the breadth of our data, right? That changes the way we relate to the world. Which goes back to then the question then becomes, if we're reading fear of the Lord in Scripture, which does come up a lot, how are we supposed to take that? Do we take that as God's instruction that despite what we see in the world and are exposed to and can look up the data on, we should still be afraid? Or is this somebody expressing their view of the relationship with God and their perception of how we should relate to God based on their experience in the time and place and culture? And depending who taught you your Christianity, you're going to come down on a different side of that question.
Fascinating.
It is. We're 10 minutes over, so we're going to stop with chapter 1 finished. Cassandra, did you have some verses missing from yours?
Maybe I really got lost because
Yeah.
it doesn't sound at all like
I had the same dilemma. So chapter 1 in the printed copy has 40 verses. Mine has 30. And I got lost a couple of times, and then I'd catch up to you, figure out where you were, because that's what happened.
I've got 3.
Yeah,
So.
you and I are probably working off of the same version. I'll have to double check what version I got this from, but apparently this is a much more expansive version. So we'll probably just all operate from this, since it has all verses. Everything that's in mine I heard in here. So you and I need copies. And we'll go from there.
Yeah, I found it, and then I lose him again.
Yeah, and that's why, because this printed version has extra verses. We're going to close with the Lord's Prayer and then say goodbye. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Thanks for coming, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you all next week.